Welcome to our masterclass with Professor Gina Neff. One of the very sort of strange but semi-delightful outcomes of this coronavirus has been the opportunity to do more digitally. And this is our first venture into the masterclass virtual space. And we look forward to doing more of this for you and bringing the alumni community together through this digital experience as we never have before. So it's really quite exciting. So do keep your eyes open for future events. This current session is being recorded, so we're hoping to be able to make it available to alumni after the event. So just be aware of that, that if you have to step away, you can come back and see it later. You are all automatically muted, which is one of the few times that Oxford has engaged in lack of free speech. But that said, we will be looking forward to sharing your questions with Professor Neff as we go forward. So it's possible for you to even adjust your screen so that you are able to only see the speakers and not the other participants by making sure that you select the speaker view option on your screen. So that's on the top of your screen. So your questions can be submitted by the chat button at the very bottom of your screen. We'll be checking through those questions and feeding them to Professor Neff towards the end. She's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll be willing to and delighted to take your questions for the remainder of the session. So we're really looking forward to some wonderful back and forth as the session progresses. So I am just delighted. I should have introduced myself. I'm Christine Fairchild, Director of Alumni Relations, and delighted to introduce Professor Gina Neff, who is a senior research fellow and associate professor at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Department of Sociology here. And her research focuses on the future of work in data-rich environments. And there couldn't be a more timely moment to introduce Gina and her topic today. So thank you very much and welcome to Gina.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you all for joining us today. My plan is to speak for about 20 minutes and then open up the conversation via the chat so we can have a more interactive conversation. I'd like to start today by sharing my slides. That wonderful moment where we are sharing. I'll put these on. I'm sure none of you have ever seen a Zoom glitch moment. I promise you too that if my kids are playing too many video games because of half-term break, that the fabulous team and alumni have offered to text me so I can make sure that the sound and the video is getting through to you. So I'm Gina Neff, and I'm a professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, where I've been studying digital work for quite a long time. Little did I know at the beginning of 2020 that my work in how construction went digital, big, large building construction went digital, would be relevant to a whole host of people. So I promise you to bring some insights from perhaps the last industry you would ever expect to embrace digital work. So I want to acknowledge that we are facing unprecedented changes to work, and I want to scope exactly what I want to cover in the 20 minutes that we have together. I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, and I've studied large-scale change in workplaces in the media industry, in personal self-tracking, digital health and wellness, and in construction. And those are three very different industries, but I think taken together, they help us think about and contextualize the changes that so many of us find ourselves in at the moment. And I'm going to talk about 5 of those today. The first, and in part because this was my first study, but also because I think it is enormously important for the moment we're in now. The first is our changing relationship to risk, both across our society, in our organizations, and the way we understand and navigate risk ourselves. The second is this relationship to others that's changing. We've had a very standard model of what corporate and professional work looks like, And in the last 3 months, we've kind of thrown that out the window to some extent. What are the trends that are durable, and what are the trends that we see emerging? The third is our relationship to ideas, social capital, and ideation. And I really want to kind of get you all thinking about what I see as one of the key challenges that we're going to have in the medium term as we take on COVID mitigation. The fourth is our relationship to technology. We're in the middle, as we know, of enormous digital changes in many workplaces. How is this moment that we find ourselves in continuous for those changes? And in what way are we going to see some discontinuities? And then fifth, I think we need to address and recognize that we are in a moment of uncertainty. We are in a medium term, short term moment where it's incredibly difficult for organizations to plan. What does that mean for how we navigate our jobs? So that's generally the kind of scale that I'm thinking of today's talks. So let's start with this relationship to risk. The last 50 years have seen an enormous fundamental shift in the relationship everyday individuals have to risk in the US and the UK. That we've seen these enormous changes in how people understand a social safety net, what they look to their employers for security, how they see the anchoring of their own career trajectory in a sense of risk and uncertainty. Now, these changes, these are underlying changes that have been going on. They have enormous implications for how managers lead and the choices that employees make right now, and where we see that we can think about kinds of cohesion and organization in our workplaces. Let me explain a little bit more. So my first study was the rise of internet industries in New York City in the beginning of the 1990s. And this was the first wave of dot-com boom and bust. And what was striking about the young employees of startup companies that I interviewed in that study was the way that people talked about taking risks, working in risky startup companies, as actually a form of control. Now, this struck me as a sociologist as completely odd. Why would you say it's you have more control over your career if you're working for a small startup than if you're working for a large organization with career paths and promotions and a kind of promise of lifelong employment? And so it was this tension, this kind of new relationship to risk that was being mapped out that really has continued in the ways we talk about where we see advancement in society for professional workers. So this concept that if you take risks, you get ahead has become almost something of a motto for a certain class of professional work. These kinds of risks are welcomed as a notion that of how you advance in your career. And related to this, we make sense of the changes happening in our careers and in larger social changes through the kinds of stories that we tell about these risks. So when the people I interviewed talked about what happened when a stock market crash really cut out the growth of their industry for about 4 years, they talked about that in terms of having wanted to take more risks or being better or smarter at taking those risks rather than as seeing those risks as something external to their control. So from a social point of view, we've gone from a society where we've thought about organizations as investing in their workers and having a long-term relationship with their employees to one in which employees increasingly over the last 50 years have been asked to navigate on quite an individual level these changes in the workplace. This is the context in which we find ourselves in at this particular moment in COVID. Now, we know there are unprecedented levels of unemployment. We know that different kinds of industries are facing these challenges differently, and yet this longer social trend of individuals needing to manage and navigate that risk underlies how we're thinking about what we do, who's responsible, and how we might navigate change. So that relationship to risk is one of the continuities that I see in the post-COVID world, that individuals need to figure out. We have changed a societal narrative about where good work comes from, and individuals need to figure out how to navigate that risk. That's the narrative. That's the story that we tell about what good work is. The second is about our relationship to others, and it is no mystery to anyone on this call that we are in a moment where we are in the social network moment. We have seen over the last 20 years the rise of online social networking sites. We've seen a phenomenal shift in where people get their news and information. We've seen an incredible proliferation, both of advertising dollars and of our attention spent on online networks. So the kind of pull to thinking about how do we build social capital in online networks in a moment when we can't be in the same room together, it should seem continuous. And yet I'd like to make an argument that we actually are going to see phenomenal and increasingly important changes in how social capital in professional work happens. I think these changes that COVID mitigation are bringing onto organizations and how professionals work will really have enormous implications, particularly for new employees and particularly for how shifting network ties happen. Let me give you an illustration, an example of this. So this is from work that I'm doing with my colleague at OII, Balázs Vedres. And Balázs has a data set of teams that, so 200 teams that were surveyed in January, just before essentially the Western world shut down. And what we see on the left-hand side of the screen is the social network map of collaboration in one team. Now, these kinds of sociograms, as sociologists call them, should be familiar to many of you. The circles represent people. The lines represent some kind of communication or collaboration tie. The green circles in this are women, and the red circles are men. Again, apologies for those of you for accessibility reasons. Green and red are not the best choices here, but bear with me. The large two center nodes are two women in one team, and they're larger because of the size of the centrality to team communication. So lots of in and out communication for these two women in this work team. Look at what happens when we shift to remote work. Suddenly, the two central women are no longer central, and that we have a man who likely was central, one of the central men, has become and taken a larger role in online work. We also see these disconnected ties. We see the circles around the periphery showing that some people on the team are not connected to other people on the team. Now, this is just one team. We're working on a project together to see how remote work impacts women's careers in remote work at this particular moment. And there, to be fair, the research, there's much we simply do not know yet. And yet, we know that the rise to remote work for so many of us in an unprecedented scale will change the kinds of social network ties that happen. For many of us who have experience, we're drawing on already established sets of social capital. So people we've met at conferences, people we know through our industry, through our organizations. That's an enormous source of strength for employees as we navigate this. But that's going to shift and change as we look at 2 more months, 3 more months, another year, another 18 months of changed work in organizations. With the announcement of companies like from Twitter saying that they are permanently offering remote work to their employees, with Facebook, for example, saying that they're offering their employees the chance to live anywhere, work from anywhere. We're going to see how people navigate these work teams that we know are so important to getting work done, accomplishing work in organizations. We're going to see this shift and change over time. So the third is related to this one, actually. It's where our ideas come from. And ideas and ideation and idea generation they really require different kinds of collaborative work than most online tools have been designed to provide. And I'll say a little bit more about this. So I think the third big change is something that we, again, see as an important continuous trend of where innovation is anchored. And yet, COVID mitigation shows that we have enormous challenges to where people are going to get innovative and good ideas. So let me give you an example from our construction work. I promised you construction. So this is from, I spent 10 years gathering data on large-scale construction projects for building information modeling. So this was this is an attempt to automate a certain mechanism of the construction planning process. And we see on the left-hand side a screen where building information modeling is happening. For the same project, we see something that the field superintendent designed. It's a whiteboard, and it was designed for helping coordinate a meeting, literally to brainstorm in a meeting. It may seem straightforward, but most of our online tools for sharing work are relatively passive. They are about sharing information. They are about, much like we are in this meeting at the moment. It's one-way channel. It's relatively passive in terms of people's engagement with the idea. It's also formal. In construction work, once something got written down in an email or in an online chat, it became part of the written record that could be used if there was a problem later on. In a highly litigious industry, this was a problem. So people were a little less risky or a little less free to think about the blue sky ideas when they were writing something down that could be said in that way. It was also inflexible. So many of our ways of online working together aren't quite yet fast enough to allow us the kind of free flow of ideas that a simple whiteboard can do better. Again, think about your own styles of work. If you had the ideal way to sit with 5 people and try to solve a problem, would you do it over a Zoom call, or would you sit around a whiteboard together? I know my preference, and unfortunately, I'm having to, instead of working with my book co-author this week, I'm having to do Zoom calls. On the other hand, these really low-tech ways that we've developed for working together can often be really active and bring more people into the conversation. Informal ways of having ideas and ideation, as we know, spark innovation in really interesting ways. And the flexibility of being able to erase, quickly draw, change things quickly on the fly really, really matters when you're trying to rapidly prototype new ideas. So the fourth trend that I see is that we are changing our relationship to technology. We already have trends in automation and remote work that were well underway, that have been jump-started and sparked in this particular moment. COVID changes, I would like to argue, have enormous implications for how society trusts in technological advances. Yes. So another example from our work in construction teams. So With a group of collaborators, we helped develop a tool that essentially allowed people in virtual time to walk through the building that they were designing. So on the right-hand side of the screen where you see an avatar and you see little initials, those initials represent different universities, so teams of students who were working in this collaborative space. And the affordance of this particular tool allowed them to see things in completely new ways. So I don't want to dismiss online work. In fact, I've spent the last decade trying to help figure out how to get companies to do online work better. In what we see on the right, we see people who are at Utrecht University with the University of Washington in Seattle, with Virginia Tech in Virginia, three very different time zones, three miles and miles apart, and yet people could be in the same space at the same time and help look through some of the problems. It's not unlike what we see on the left-hand side, which is a group of collaborators also looking through the design of a building and trying to think about looking at and seeing the problem. I'd like to suggest that for those of us who don't work in visual design in our daily practice, that what we see here really is two sets of teams using the tools they have at hand to figure out how they get to a shared understanding with other people in the team. And that can often be hard in the kinds of tools that we're using for online meetings. So if there's one kind of takeaway from this relationship of technology point that I'd like to make, it's not simply that there will be more remote work or more work will be automated, but rather, are there ways that we can use the tools at hand to help others understand where we're coming from on a problem and open up that solution generation space for others to join us? Then my final point really is a call to all of you to join the conversation. We're really in a moment of phenomenal uncertainty. A sociologist, Anthony Giddens, wrote about the ontological uncertainty and what it does to people. We've been able to kind of believe that tomorrow is going to be a day just like yesterday. And we've been in the last 2.5 months in a situation where that's not really true. When are our kids going to go back to school? When will it be safe to travel? When will universities open back up to in-person teaching? We don't know the answers to these. But the uncertainty that we're in this moment is not permanent. We only have to look to the last global pandemic in 1918 to see that things did get back to a normal. So how we define our work in this moment doesn't have to define how organizations work in the future. In fact, I don't have a crystal ball, but I do think that we're going to see that the challenges and limitations of online work will help be one of the forces that bring us back together when it's safe to go back to work. In the meantime, these changes have enormous implications in testing people's ability for navigating this uncertainty. And coupled, I would argue, with this shift of risk that we talked about in the first point, we're going to see a kind of differentiation of workers, people who are able to navigate that uncertainty and do it well, and then people who need a little more support from their managers, from their work teams, or in a larger sense to understand and navigate what is going to happen. With that, I'm going to turn us over for your questions, which I'm very much looking forward to. I just want to make a little bid. Next week we have, as part of Oxford's COVID conversations, I'm having a conversation with the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Rasmus Nielsen, on misinformation and trust in this particular moment. I did a survey on AI and people's trust in AI recently, and Rasmus has been doing a a project on trust in news. And so we're going to have a joint conversation this time next week. And we would like you to join us for that if you can. And with that, I want to thank all of you for your attention. You've been an attentive class. I am looking forward to your questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Christine for a moment to help us navigate the chat.
Lovely. Gina, thank you so much. And that was absolutely fascinating. As a manager myself, working with a team of extremely talented and committed individuals, it's been so interesting to see how the team has shifted in this new environment, how they've had to adapt to new skills, find new skills, really switch the way in which they work with each other, as you described it so clearly. And it's been interesting to see the things that have been a benefit to us, so that we've really been able to grab and make exciting new progress with, but then the things that we feel potentially we may have lost, and that notion of social networks and connecting with people on the fly as you're making a cup of tea, sharing of ideas in that wonderful organic kind of experiential way I miss that very much. Everything now has to be done very sort of deliberately and intelligently in terms of making an appointment with somebody or trying to find the right way to share ideas. So that's been so helpful. And there are some terrific questions here from a very interesting group of people. So I will start with, I'll start sort of at the beginning of where these questions came from. So as they came in. So here's a question. What different or additional considerations will be given to environmental issues in the post-coronavirus workplace?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. I mean, we've certainly learned, all of us are learning that we probably don't need to travel as much as we have been. And we're figuring out ways, and really creative ways, to do events and connections that don't involve carbon offsets. I appreciated waiting as people were filing in. Someone said, it's great that we're doing alumni events that bring in people who live time zones away. And again, I'm grateful that we're able to have this event in this manner. I do think people will be very aware of that. We also are able to track, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, but we're able to track right now what our carbon emissions, how much we've reduced our carbon emissions in this particular time. And I think that'll be a useful way as we get back to work. Of course, many things depend on large supply chains. I, for one, am incredibly grateful that the UK food supply chain has held fairly solidly. We can joke all we want about flour shortages and yeast shortages in the beginning of COVID lockdown in the UK, but for the most part, shelves have been able to be stocked and people have been fed. So I think we need to be a little careful when we think about these issues on a very big scale for organizations, right? What works for my organization and putting people together in the same room to have ideas might not be the same solution that works for a Tesco, for example.
Terrific. So here's an interesting question. Individuals who have less or no choices, unequal or unfair work situations, how do you think they'll be managing their risks in this environment?
Yeah, this is a great question. I wrote, a Twitter diatribe is really the best way to say it. An essay that I published first on Twitter about the low wage work in nursing homes or care homes, prisons in the United States, and in meatpacking plants. And these were three low wage work places where people do have very little agency in their jobs. They're very highly controlled organizations. Those have been sites of infection, at least in the United States. And we continue to see in the UK, in care homes in particular, we've seen enormous costs to workers in those positions. So yes, I don't want to make light. And I'm also making a very big assumption here that I'm speaking to the primary audience of Oxford alumni, that the kind of jobs Oxford alumni are in are probably not meatpacking plants in Iowa, right? That the kinds of professional work that universities, that we've thought university education prepares us for, gives more agency and autonomy. I worry particularly about organizations that have and bring together both sets of workers. So for example, in the large, before I went to graduate school, I worked as a union organizer, and I worked in the world's largest meatpacking plant, the Smithfield plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina, trying to, unsuccessfully at that time, but successfully later, trying to organize that plant. And, you know, what you see at companies like Smithfield, it's part of a global corporate major organization. And yet the people in Tar Heel, North Carolina have fewer choices for their employment. I worry about the organizations that have that great disparity within the organization. So when I look at organizations like Amazon, for example, they're cash rich. They're able to invest, and they are announcing that they have invested in their warehouse workers. And yet the navigation of what work will look like for workers in the fulfillment centers of Amazon is very different from the techies who are designing the high-tech services that Amazon is profiting from.
So this next question actually is a lovely echo to that, because it picks up what you're talking about. I'm wondering about the differences between societal, organizational, and individual attitudes to risk.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced these are identical.
Yeah.
Neither am I sure that attitudes to risk are that similar in the US and the UK. Take the attitude to bankruptcy as an example. Do you have any thoughts?
That's great. And this is the moment where I really wish we were in the room together, because I would love for you to expand that attitudes towards bankruptcy. I'm assuming you are referring to an American set of laws that make it a little easier to declare bankruptcy, to go into bankruptcy protection for individuals, a little less stigma there than perhaps here. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That there are first cultural differences to risk. When I studied risk among this first wave of internet startup workers, and again, workers, not founders, people who went to work for companies, I was really taken by how much they articulated the kinds of, and echoed the kinds of attitudes about risk that their companies were selling to venture capitalists and the stock market, right? That, this is a high risk, high growth industry, and therefore it's going to be good for me. And it was that conflation of organizational risk and individual risk in particular that I really wanted to define and unpack and understand. That's why the book was called Venture Labor, right? A resource from everyday employees of an investment in their companies. And my personal attitude about that is that there is something different that's happened. And it is something that I think is pretty particular to a technology ethos that's come from Silicon Valley, which we see having influential ripples throughout the world as other kinds of tech industries in other locations become visible and important. So yes, I absolutely agree with you that what we see in risk in one place isn't what we see in attitudes towards risk in the other. That said, the idea that we have social protection, for example, very different cross-culturally and can be mapped and changed in terms of social welfare protections. I wonder if we're going to have different kinds of conversations about that, given the risk that people face in COVID. So knowing that we face and have to make choices and challenges, are we going to see those differences emerge more starkly?
So speaking of what is going to emerge, here's one. It's very hard to imagine that after this large-scale work from home experiment, companies or employees will want to go back to the status quo from before the crisis. But I'm curious to hear what's your view on the matter.
Yeah, again, it's tough, right? Because we don't want to make a sweeping proclamation about all kinds of work. You're absolutely right. I think we've learned that work from home can work for some people. We're also really seeing, and I want to come back to Christine and bring Christine's experience into this too. We're also seeing in the first 6 to 8, 9 weeks that most of us have been working from home, we've seen these things that we know we miss. And I'm not simply talking about a wireless keyboard and a monitor that brings our computers up. We're missing those conversations with colleagues that allow for a kind of richness in communication. We're missing what my collaborator and I have called in a series of papers the messy talk, right? We're missing the kinds of interactions that really help us generate new ideas. We're missing that reminds me, have you thought about this that we get when we can run into our colleagues or when we're face to face, but it's really hard to do when we're setting our work up in these discrete elements. Christine, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you are navigating as a manager right now.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the things that this has done to us is it has made us sort of more intensely tied to this computer, hasn't it? In that every morning starts at 8:30 and we're pretty much on this computer all day long, and we've lost the ability to kind of observe each other in those other settings or see each other in meetings collectively where we might see different types of behavior come out. So as a manager, your only way of viewing your employees is through this sort of one-way screen, which is, you could say it's two-way. To some degree it is two-way, but it's not as full and fully dimensional a view. So I think it's challenging to manage in these situations. I think it also calls into mind the way different people cope with this differently, and the idea of really trying to ensure that that morale stays up, that people feel engaged and feel part of something when they're not actually in the office has been a challenge. And I think, like many offices, we're experimenting with a lot of really wonderful and quite delightful social engagement, whether it's through sort of fun little pub quiz type things. Jenny Wood, who is managing behind the scenes on this call, had a challenge of introducing a new origami shape for us every day for a period of about a week. So there are ways that you sort of deploy some morale boosting experiences for people to try to maintain that sense of cohesion and collective spirit. But it is a very different way to manage. It's a very difficult way to feel that you are, it's hard to feel that you are as truly engaged with your staff as you would have been in the office.
That's why I'm a little bullish on going back to work when it's safe, on safe back to work. I think there's many types of work that really rely on those personal relationships and really rely on getting renewed energy from the people around you. Now, will organizations understand that they can trust their professionals to work from home and make good decisions? Absolutely. I think for a strata of workers, that's the ability to do more work from home is going to be there. But I don't think we're about to see the end of the office just yet. Again, we know we're in a short run, though it may feel like a long run. We know we're in a 18-month to 2-year time window. What's going to happen when after that when we know it's safe after this pandemic, people are going to be really hungry for connecting with clients, connecting with others, connecting with their bosses. In the meantime, I'm particularly concerned for the type of employee who isn't as able to navigate these online social networks. Mm-hmm. So, the kinds of things that we know, the little water cooler chat done over Microsoft Teams doesn't replace getting to see people every day and understanding their role in the organization. And so I do see that there's going to be room for that. I think if I were to give advice for professionals right now, and since we're in a group of alumni, to kind of think about what strategies are working for you, I'll share what I've been doing. I've been making a particular effort to make new connections right now, and it's not easy. So I was on the road, every 2 weeks I was giving a talk somewhere. I would meet new people, new collaborations would come out, new ideas. I'm the kind of person that really feeds on that. So I've been in my kind of larger network, I've been trying to identify 1 to 2 people that I can reach out to and then have a one-to-one conversation. And it's the kind of conversation that you might have a side meetup when you go to a conference, or you're standing in the same queue for coffee at a talk or a lecture and you have a conversation. It's a little bit harder to do that, but if you can make that happen, then that I think amplifies some of the things that some of the advantages of the online networking and the things that we can do now that we know build real social capital. The other thing I would say is to think about within your organizations, think about and be really articulate about who might be marginalized and how centralities are changing. So can we identify and understand who's becoming newly central in online work? And then how might that shift and change? And what could we do as interventions? So that's in part the research that we want to kick off right now at the moment with my collaborator, Balázs Vedres. Can we actually start to map that out? And I think we can.
So interesting to think of that, because you're so right. I think the office dynamics, if you will, change so much when you're in this sort of one-dimensional world. People who were in the hub are less in the hub because they are sort of having to be less central and more peripheral, if you will, physically. Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting question that has to do with people's work at home. So when organizations think of economical impact when shifting large scale to work from home, how do they factor in employee home social contracts? Small home, everyone fighting for bandwidth, poor conditions in emerging markets, etc. Is not that breaking a social contract between employer to put the entire burden on the home institutions for profit reasons?
Well, I'm going to be a flip for a moment. We used to call that the putting out system, and we had the putting out system in which employers gave the work to people to do within their own homes, and then they brought the piecemeal work back to the employer, right? This was early pre-industrial manufacturing, the way in which we had larger scale work getting done. We have that replicated too through gig work. So let's not forget that we have a growing segment of work that depends on people providing their own work-ready tools to be able to essentially work as a contractor for their employer, right, in direct kind of exchange. So, so I think the question is well put, that we've had a social contract that basically has said there's a domestic life and there's a work life. We know that in this moment of challenges, that blurring of lines is really, really difficult for some people to navigate. You see my bookshelf of credibility. This is literally the only square meter in my home that is not covered with Lego. It's the only room I can close a door on and my kids won't barge in, right? So, you know, we know that, you know, for parents, this is challenging. We know people who have other caring responsibilities, this is challenging. But two, you know, most of us did not make home purchases or rent our homes. We did not make our home choices based on the fact that we would be living there and working there 24/7 for the next 5 years.
It's such a good point. In fact, somebody asked earlier, she says, I was doing remote working from home 40 years ago. It's been technically possible since then, but generally managers didn't trust employees to work this way. And I think what we're seeing is employers are having to trust them to work this way. But do you think that that's changed the way employers in general look at this concept of remote working? Do you think we're more open to it now than ever before?
Well, let's understand that we are working during a crisis, right? And I have been incredibly encouraged by organizations that have been able to recognize and understand that this isn't going to be the most productive time for most people's work with everything going on in that we're trying to manage and navigate. And communicating that care for employees is incredibly important right now. That said, you know, we've had in some industries, we've had a very interesting relationship to the notion of work from anywhere. For example, technology companies, the joke has always been, of course you can work from anywhere. You can choose to work whatever 20 hours a day you want, wherever you want to be. So, you know, having real conversations about what our work-life balance is and what our productivity standards are, I think will help. Again, you know, we're making assumptions about professional work. That's not likely to happen in low-wage work that's very, very highly controlled and has been very highly surveilled in using digital technologies. So a study that came out of the University of Virginia, a great study that came out of University of Virginia, looked at professionals' relationships to their smartphones to hourly wage workers' relationship to their smartphones. And it's a fabulous study because it looked at the same region. This was in the US, but I think these trends hold true generally that in low wage work in the US, a smartphone was seen as a necessity for scheduling, for helping you navigate the employer's information systems, but very highly controlled and contested. Who could look at their phone when? Whereas for professional workers, the idea of having a smartphone always at the ready is a sign of professionalism, right? Taking your phone on vacation so the office could call you is one of the markers of so-called importance. And so I think we can see that these kinds of notions of trust and control, you know, they're going to continue to be very marked by where people are in that distinction.
So here's a question about sort of that balance question, the question of well-being and employers ensuring the well-being of their staff. So thank you very much for this interesting talk. As an anthropologist, I've been particularly interested in the question of well-being and wellness at work, and how employers can seriously improve their workers' overall well-being, especially in this COVID situation. Do you see any developments in terms of this issue, or is something that is part of the planning for the future of work?
That's a fabulous question. So I wrote a book on digital self-tracking that touches on how employers were taking and using the whole proliferation of digital tools to encourage more exercise and healthier habits. And we're now in a moment where these kinds of self-tracking choices become choices about keeping other people safe as well. And a whole conversation that we could be having about what it's going to take to get people back safe to work while we're managing the COVID pandemic. So, yes, I think I'm going to be very interested to see how this plays out. On the one hand, healthy workplaces are safe workplaces. And that's an argument that I've been making and will continue to make, right? That when we have workplaces that are safe for people, they're safe for communities and they're safe for the workers. And that's a very good thing. And I think given trends that have happened in self-tracking and workplace wellness programs, I think we can see some movement on that front. Again, it's going to take kinds of employers who have the ability, the progressive ability to navigate that, and sometimes the cash on hand to ensure that. So we have seen very different reactions in, say, some food and meat packing plants, for example. We've seen very different reactions to what it takes to make factory work, what it will take to make factory work safe.
Great. We've had two really interesting questions about not the workplace, but actually the city and the impact of this whole experience on cities in general. So you need to put your urban planning hat on here, Gina. So I'll give you both of the questions because they're really quite interesting. What is the impact on the city? The classic downtown is a collection of office buildings. Is remote working the death of downtown? And then the second one, which is a large part of the city is also the retail experience, which is being decimated at the same time. In the UK, there's potentially going to be a flight from the city to the perceived safety of country living, which in turn leads people to want to work remotely. Do you have any thoughts on whether there will be shifts in wider society along these lines?
Yeah, I mean, retail, let's start with retail and work our way up. Retail was already having a challenging moment anyway, and high street retail in the UK particularly, really needing to figure out what is the retail experience in a world where online shopping is on the rise. And what is the retail experience in a world where increasingly brands are trying to build a global market. So what's the relationship to space and place? So that's something that's going on. Restaurants too were having this challenge, right? How do you make the restaurant experience at the margins that restaurants operate on? How do you make that fine dining experience work without resorting to the mass dining experience? So these were two kind of anchors of that experience. And yet, as soon as we see a little bit of easing in restrictions in the United States, we see people flocking back to shopping and retail and dining experience. So experience isn't going to go away. We're going to really hope for that. The retail bugaboo of trying to solve how do you make retail viable in a moment where the online experience is getting increasingly better. I think that is a big challenge. So yeah, but cities will continue to flourish. We're going to see, as we've already seen, a very top percentage of people with means leave cities, but they're also the first to come back to cities. They're also the ones who benefit from the concentrations of people and capital that are in those cities. So social theory kind of says, sure, we'll see a little bit of flight to the country, but expect that central pull back to the city when it's safe. That's my prediction.
Excellent. Well, I think have time for maybe one or maybe two more questions. We're coming towards the end. I'm intrigued by the comparison between pre-revolution industrial processes, the putting out system, and the growing gig economy of today. The Luddites weren't very keen on machinery in factories. Will there be a comparable reaction as we move to a new distributed model of work?
I think we are seeing people in gig economy work already start to challenge and question the terms under which they're being asked to work. Um, the one of the biggest challenges in gig economy work is the lack of transparency, where the contract starts with one set of terms, and then through algorithmic pricing and matching, the contract then the terms of the contract kind of shift, and that people end up working under very different terms. That feels and is unfair, and that's not sustainable on the long term. So I do think that we're going to see a kind of articulation. We're seeing it in, I have two colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, Mark Graham and Vili Ledrovita, who both work on gig economy work. Mark increasingly on gig economy work in the global south, and Vili in kind of thinking about these large scale economic changes. I think we're going to increasingly see people push back on those terms. Again, you know, I get hope and inspiration from when people have great entrepreneurial ideas and connect and work with others to really remake the world in fabulous ways. And I am hopeful that we can figure out how to capture that and how to do that, even in a moment where you know, making those connections are hard. So I saw one question go by quickly that was really about how do you reproduce that social connectivity, and I just kind of want to make a call that I think that's that is one of the things that we really need to be attentive to as we go forward. You know, events like these, the alumni network, the opportunities that we have in this particular moment, I think give us a bit of a bright spot of what could be possible. There are other things that I think individually we can begin to do to help position ourselves to be first to survive and thrive in this particular difficult moment, but second, really to come out of it on the other side, ready to take on these challenges of the really hard work it's going to be to rebuild the kinds of societies we want.
Gina, that's a perfect moment to stop, and thank you so much. It's lovely to end on a hopeful note. Thank you for your time and attention to this. It's really fascinating. And thank you to all of you alumni who are on this call and who asked such great and pertinent questions. There were many more questions in the queue. I wish we could have gotten to these, but really cannot thank you enough, Gina. And good luck with the work ahead. And we are very grateful for all the insights you've given us.
Thank you,
everybody.
And thank you all. You've been a fantastic audience. I really appreciate it.
Lovely. So check out Gina's talk next week. Is it next week or was it the week after, Gina? Sorry.
It's the 3rd. Isn't that next week?
So yes, it is. I think it's next Thursday.
Next Wednesday.
Wednesday, yes. So terrific. Another chance to see you.
Thanks.
So thank you all and greetings from Oxford, and hope to connect with you soon.